Mic test, 1, 2, 3. Mic test, much better. Mic test, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, but they're not.
1, 1, 1, 2, 3.
Right.
This hearing will come to order. We welcome everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the findings and recommendations in the Syria Study Group's final report. Given the timing of this hearing, we will have the opportunity to discuss the ramifications of recent U.S. policy changes in Syria and how the study group recommendations can still address our challenges there. I thank our witnesses for appearing today, and without objection, I move to enter the full Syria Study Group report into the record. I now recognize myself for purpose of making an opening statement. Thank you, we do indeed. Ms. Stroul, Mr. Singh, thanks very much for testifying today and for your work on the final report of the Syria Study Group. Your report is a thoughtful, informed overview of the Syrian conflict and provides pragmatic recommendations for how American policymakers can protect U.S. interests and stabilize Syria. Now, it is well known that President Trump does not like to read, but I wish that he had skimmed the executive summary of your report before his recent phone call with Turkish President Erdogan. Your assessment notes the liberation of ISIS-held territory does not eliminate the group's threat to the United States. It also notes the ISIS detainee population is a long-term challenge that is not being adequately addressed, that Iran continues to entrench itself in Syria, Russia and Iran show few serious signs of divergence, that the United States underestimated Russia's ability to use Syria as an arena for regional influence, and a Turkish incursion into northeastern Syria would represent a major setback to U.S. aims in Syria and a new crisis for the U.S.-Turkish relationship. And despite these challenges, the United States maintains leverage to shape an outcome in Syria that protects core U.S. national security interests. And in the 10 days since President Trump's decision to hastily withdraw U.S. forces in northeastern Syria and consent to Turkey's invasion of the region, your assessment has, in fact, sadly, borne out. Rarely has a foreign policy decision by a United States president yielded this many disastrous consequences this quickly. Most importantly, President Trump's irresponsible choice makes the American people less safe. The chaos in Syria has allowed hundreds and likely thousands of ISIS fighters and supporters to break out of prison. Yesterday, senior U.S. officials told Foreign Policy that Turkish-backed forces are deliberately releasing ISIS detainees previously held by Kurdish fighters, and as your report notes, ISIS has already transitioned to an insurgency and, in the absence of effective pressure against it, will utilize its Syrian sanctuary for organizing, instructing, and inspiring external attacks. Tragically, like other aspects of your assessment, I expect this prediction to ring true in the coming weeks and months. The president also forced Kurdish forces to reach an agreement with Bashar al-Assad, allowing his soldiers and Russian troops to expand their presence in northeastern Syria. Yesterday, Russian media circulated videos showing Russian soldiers and their proxies taking over recently abandoned U.S. bases in the region. This outcome will also benefit Iran by reinforcing the position of its ally, Assad. It is unclear how allowing Tehran to fortify a land bridge to the Mediterranean, enabling it to threaten our ally Israel, is consistent with the president's maximum pressure policy on Iran. It is also unclear how ceding the field to Putin in Syria supports the administration's great power competition strategy. The president's rash decision also put American soldiers in danger. On Friday, Turkish troops fired artillery at an American base. A day later, Turkish-backed forces cut the main highway in northeastern Syria, effectively isolating U.S. soldiers in the region. And while I am thankful no Americans were hurt in either case, both incidents placed American troops directly in harm's way and were a direct result of President Trump's short-sighted choice. The president justified his decision by claiming that he is reducing our presence in the Middle East and terminating America's endless wars. But the administration just sent an additional 1,800 troops to Saudi Arabia. Secretary of Defense Esper noted on Friday that an additional 14,000 American personnel have been deployed in the Middle East since May. These deployments include airborne early warning aircraft squadrons, maritime patrol squadrons, Patriot air and missile defense batteries, B-52 bombers and an aircraft carrier strike group, and I support the objective of this increased troop presence to deter Iran. But the president's claim that he is reducing the U.S. role in the Middle East is simply a lie, and the American people see right through it. The situation in Syria is tragic, because it could have been avoided with real strategic diplomacy. The American presence in Syria was not an endless war, but a limited, sustainable, efficient deployment, one of the notable successes of recent U.S. policy in the Middle East. But President Trump threw it all away, yielding U.S. leverage, putting American troops and civilians in danger, undermining our credibility, dividing NATO, removing pressure on ISIS, giving a strategic victory to our adversaries, and betraying our Kurdish partners who fought valiantly in recent years to counter ISIS with American support. This is not just my opinion, but one that most Republicans share. Senator Graham labeled President Trump's decision the biggest blunder of his presidency and noted, "We are witnessing ethnic cleansing in Syria by Turkey, the destruction of a reliable ally in the Kurds, and the reemergence of ISIS." Representative Cheney said the president's choice was impossible to understand. Senator Rubio claimed the damage to our reputation and national interests will be extraordinary and long-lasting. And President Trump's former ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, argued the Kurds were instrumental in our successful fight against ISIS in Syria. Leaving them to die is a big mistake. I could go on. That one decision could unite both Democrats and Republicans on Syria policy and yield this many calamitous results says a lot about President Trump's capabilities as commander-in-chief. The current unrest in Syria sadly epitomizes his strategically confused and morally bankrupt approach to the world. And I finally would just urge my Republican colleagues to remember that Syria is not the only example of the president abandoning a partner in the face of an aggressor. President Trump withheld $391 million in congressionally appropriated security assistance to Ukraine, a state that is at war with Russia in a conflict that has killed more than 13,000 people as part of an effort to compel the Ukrainian government to dig up dirt on its political opponent. That behavior should unite us all, Republican, Democrat, Independent, in rejecting a foreign policy that has put personal ambition over national interest and sullied our nation's honor and credibility. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony and suggestions on how the U.S. can salvage our policy and achieve our national interests in Syria, end a conflict that has led to the deaths of over 600,000 people, and help the Syrian people build a better future, one that is not dictated by Bashar al-Assad, by Russia, and by Iran. And with that, I yield to Mr. Wilson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this important and timely hearing. Tragically, the United States Syria policy has been a failure from the very start. It has been an example of American strategic failure at every point, from the notorious red line by President Barack Obama that was never enforced to the reckless betrayal of the Kurds in the recent days. But I believe that our failure in Syria is far greater than a strategic misstep. Our Syria policy over the last 8 years represents a deep moral challenge to all of us. How could we stand by while a brutal authoritarian regime massacres its people indiscriminately? How can we talk of red lines? We sit here over 8 years after Bashar Assad began butchering the Syrian people using poison gas and barrel bombs, still trying to figure out what our policy should be. But it's not just us. It's the entire international community that is complicit in the privations of the Assad regime and its backers in Iran and Russia. The international system, as we know it, was founded in the aftermath of the humanitarian horror and catastrophe of the Holocaust. But it has failed as well to prevent the very tragedy that it was supposed to act as a bulwark against. The enemies of freedom and democracy have hijacked our multilateral institutions. Instead of promoting liberty, they are exploited to cement tyranny and oppression. Developments over the past week have only underscored the importance of the work that our esteemed witnesses here today have spent so much time. I was deeply disappointed by the administration's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northeastern Syria and effectively greenlight a Turkish incursion, putting our Kurdish allies at great peril. The Syria Study Group presciently warned against such a withdrawal and outlined the potential negative consequences that we are unfortunately witnessing today. Like Chairman Deutsch, I am increasingly concerned about the resurgence of ISIS on the heels of the U.S. withdrawal. Our withdrawal from Syria creates dangerous breathing room for ISIS elements in the region, which can ultimately endanger American families back home from terrorist safe havens overseas. In order to prevent them from coming here, we must fight them over there. Our force of about 1,000 American soldiers in Syria was a minuscule percentage of all American military forces in uniform today. But the role of this small contingent was outsized. They help protect the world from the dangers of ISIS, establishing safe havens to threaten American families. This was extremely cost-effective military investment. It seems to me the only real winners of our withdrawal are Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the Assad regime, in addition to the ISIS terrorists. But the bigger problem is that our withdrawal from Syria could have consequences in virtually every other arena of U.S. foreign policy. In a single stroke, we have sadly undermined U.S. credibility everywhere. The move solidifies a concern and fear that America is receding from the world stage, inspiring and enabling the forces of tyranny everywhere, which has not been the President's policy of peace through strength. Furthermore, the Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, continues its barbaric assault on Idlib, Syria, as we speak. Reports over the past few days indicate that Russia has intentionally bombed over a dozen hospitals in the province. Russia clearly is not a partner in Syria, but an adversary. How many Syrians must be killed until we take action to stop this killing machine? There is simply no solution for Syria with Assad in power. As the chairman has indicated, I'd like to conclude by saying that we know America has been the moral actor on the world stage. We've always aimed to do the right thing, and the people of the world know that. They know that the values America has stood for. We believe that we still can return to that ideal. In my opinion, there's simply no substitute for American leadership to preserve peace through strength. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I now will recognize members of the subcommittee for a 1-minute opening statement, should they choose to make one. Mr. Liu, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Wilson, for your opening statement. I don't object to withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. I object in how that was done. Because of Donald Trump's impulsive decision with no planning and no coordination, we now have ISIS terrorists that have been set free in Syria. We have Turkish forces slaughtering our allies, the Kurds, and then we have Russian military forces gleefully taking over U.S. military facilities. If you look at Donald Trump's foreign policy, many of his actions have principally benefited Russia, from attacking NATO to blocking military aid to Ukraine to now his decision in Syria. So I think it's appropriate for the American people to ask the question of, when it comes to Vladimir Putin, why does it always seem like Donald Trump bends the knee? I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Shabbat, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a former chairman of this subcommittee, let me just say that the situation in Syria has been truly a tragedy to watch unfold. Over the past now 8 years, we've witnessed just how brutal Bashar al-Assad truly is and the barbaric lengths he's willing to go to hold on to power. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed and millions forced to flee, creating one of the world's worst refugee crises today. The civil war also created a vacuum for groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda to flourish, while opening a doorway for Iran to advance its goal of regional hegemony and further enabling it to threaten our key ally in the region, Israel. Defeating ISIS, al-Qaeda, and Iran, as well as supporting Israel, remain critical national security priorities that I believe most Americans support. So I look forward to discussing the report, especially in light of the changes in our Syria policy since it was released, and how we can move forward to accomplish our objectives. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
It's not surprising that huge bipartisan majorities rejected this action by the President in a vote just half an hour ago on the floor. This is an unforced error. We saw northeast Syria stable, our costs and our casualties contained, ISIS in prison camps, and the Kurds who guarded them in prison camps and who are our allies safe. Now the Kurds are subject to slaughter, and ISIS may very well be liberated. This is a mistake of such magnitude, it's hard to imagine that it is a mistake made in good faith. One possibility is that an intentional gift to Putin. The other possibility is that Turkey threatened to wage war against the United States, and rather than level with the American people, the President decided to pretend that this was some sort of voluntary withdrawal. This cutting and running will not only imperil our policy and in the Middle East, it will undercut our alliances everywhere in the world. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cicilline, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, for holding this important and timely hearing. 10 days ago, President Trump sealed the fates of our Kurdish partners in Syria when he gave President Erdogan of Turkey the green light to invade, setting off a humanitarian disaster and reigniting chaos in northern Syria. I believe this callous and reckless decision will go down in history not only for its disregard for human life, but for the strategic malpractice of placing American troops in harm's way, allowing thousands of ISIS prisoners to go free, and ceding influence over the region to Russia and the Assad regime. Like many, I have been mystified by the administration's decision to allow this invasion to go forward in their ham-fisted attempts to clean up the colossal mess they have made. No matter what they do, the administration can't bring back murdered Kurdish children, they can't reclaim our American military positions and equipment seized by the Russians, and they can't bring back our credibility, which has been squandered as we betray the trust of our Kurdish allies. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your views on what efforts we can make as a Congress and what actions you would recommend to the administration to try to salvage this horrific situation. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Do any other members of the subcommittee wish to make an opening statement? Seeing none, without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Ms. Dana Stroul is co-chair of the Syria Study Group. She is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Program on Arab Politics, and previously served for 5 years as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Before Capitol Hill, she worked on Middle East policy in the Office of Secretary of Defense, at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, and economic political affairs at the U.S. Institute of Peace on Civilian Military Relations in Iraq, and at the National Democratic Institute on Gulf Affairs. Mr. Michael Singh is also co-chair of the Syria Study Group. He's the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and previously served as a senior director for Near East and North African Affairs at the White House from 2007 to 2008, director for several Middle Eastern countries, including Iran and Syria, on the NSC staff from 2005 to 2007. He also served as special assistant to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, as well as staff aide to the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Thank you both for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the hearing record. I thank you both sincerely for being here at this timely moment in particular. We will now start with Ms. Stroul. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present the final report of the congressionally mandated Syria Study Group. It was an honor to co-chair this bipartisan group of experts along with my colleague, Mike Singh. When the Syria Study Group released its final report last month, we intentionally started by articulating why Syria still matters. Making this case is not something that our group took for granted, especially at a time of heightened public debate about the U.S. role in the world and what we should invest to achieve U.S. objectives. The group was unanimous in its conclusion that what happens in Syria does not stay in Syria. Moreover, we argued that if sufficiently resourced and prioritized, the United States retained compelling forms of leverage to influence an outcome in Syria that protects U.S. interests. Decisions made in Washington over the last 10 days have enormous implications for the future trajectory of the conflict in Syria and for U.S. interests. Mr. Singh will discuss the study group's specific assessments and recommendations, but needless to say, Syria still matters. The fundamental drivers of conflict and violence in Syria are unchanged today. Notably, there is bipartisan acknowledgement of these points here in Congress. The conflict in Syria was largely relegated to the margins of public attention before last week. Now it is front and center of international headlines and has captured domestic attention. As the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government work to articulate what U.S. policy can realistically achieve when the majority of U.S. forces in Syria are withdrawn, our report proposes a series of specific non-military recommendations. But it is also important to take a step back and remind ourselves of the origins of this conflict and situate Syria within the broader strategic landscape of U.S. national security. Syria poses 5 strategic challenges: international terrorism, Iran, Russia, refugees, and international norms. The current conflict began as peaceful protests against an autocratic dictator, one of the many uprisings of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. Though many hoped that protests in Syria might open the door to positive change, those hopes were quickly dashed as Syria rapidly devolved into a crucible of intersecting conflicts that have reverberated well beyond the Middle East. The Assad regime survived in power for decades by operating at the intersection of criminality and terrorism. The United States designated Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1979. We know the nature of this regime. Assad facilitated the movement of al-Qaeda operatives during the Iraq War to attack U.S. forces, and he will seek to leverage al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters in Syria again when it suits his needs. Syria today provides safe haven to the world's most dangerous terrorist groups. Idlib, for example, is home to the greatest concentration of foreign fighters since Afghanistan in the 1980s. ISIS no longer holds territory, but was already reconstituting as an insurgent force. It will replenish its ranks with fighters breaking out of detention facilities today and will prey on vulnerable communities as the humanitarian situation deteriorates. Iran seeks to turn Syria into a forward base for its missiles and advanced weapons and has exploited the conflict to entrench itself in Syria's economic and social fabric. Israeli strikes and U.S. sanctions prevented Iran from consolidating these gains, but come at the increased risk of war between Iran and Israel. That risk is now increased today. Russia, too, has exploited the conflict. Through its intervention in Syria, Moscow established itself as a major player in the Middle East for the first time in decades. U.S. partners across the region have expanded ties and look to Moscow, not Washington, for mediation. Russia is positioning itself to broker an agreement between Assad and Turkey, and also played a role in the agreement reached between the Syrian Democratic Forces and Assad. The arc of crisis and xenophobic discourse from the Middle East to Europe follows Syrian refugees who fled a deliberate campaign of violence against civilians by Assad, Russia, and ISIS. Refugees have strained the economies of Syria's neighbors and roiled politics in Europe, yet conditions in Syria are not suitable for safe, voluntary, or dignified return. Finally, the Assad regime and its partners have smashed every norm of conflict by targeting hospitals and schools, deploying chemical weapons and barrel bombs, and using starvation and mass murder as weapons of war. To date, there have been no meaningful consequences for these actions. We should expect that future authoritarians, when faced with peaceful protests, may look to the Syrian case and assume that mass civilian homicide will not be challenged in any credible way, setting new precedents for conduct in war. I only have a few seconds left. Syria is a conflict where the two great U.S. concerns, international terrorism and great power rivals, come together. It is not a conflict that can be contained or ignored. The rapid development shaping both the battlefield and political realignments in Syria will not end this conflict. They will only set conditions for the next phase of war. The study group's final report remains relevant today, which my colleague will now detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stroul. Mr. Singh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee, thanks so much for this opportunity to testify, and thank you to Congress for the opportunity to serve as chairman, co-chair, I should say, of the Syria Study Group, and it was an honor to serve alongside Ms. Stroul as my co-chair. As Dana noted, Syria does matter, and Syria has resisted all of our efforts over the years to ignore it, to contain the conflict, to cauterize the conflict, as some used to say. And it still matters. The report that we put out just a couple of weeks ago offers what I think is a pretty sobering assessment of the conflict there. I wouldn't want to give the impression that everything was hunky-dory before recent decisions. It wasn't. But in the last few days, things have gotten much worse, I would say. The report, at its core, is a strategy of consolidating our gains in northeastern Syria, of working towards a political settlement to the conflict, which is ultimately what's necessary to address all of those problems that Ms. Stroul was talking about, and taking steps to protect American interests if such a settlement couldn't be reached, if it proved elusive. At the time we put out our report, our view was the U.S. had such a strategy, but that essentially that strategy was undermined by a couple of big things. One was inadequate resourcing. A good example of this was the administration's decision not to spend the stabilization funding in northeastern Syria that the Congress had appropriated. And then it was also undermined by the perception around the world that the high-level leadership in the U.S. government simply wasn't committed to this strategy we were talking about. When our officials were going around the world trying to recruit other countries to contribute militarily to the conflict, the question that they had in their minds was, is the United States really going to be committed to this mission? And I think that that question has unfortunately been answered in the negative in recent days. Fast forwarding to today, now the United States, I think, lacks a strategy for Syria, if I can put it bluntly. And U.S. officials are going to need to scramble to reverse engineer a strategy to conform with the decisions that have been made by the White House in recent days. Rather than consolidating our gains, my fear is those gains that we've made in northeastern Syria are now going to be reversed. And a political settlement on terms favorable to U.S. interests, I think, is now less likely. And this is not just the result of a poor decision being made by the White House. I think this is also the result of, frankly, poor planning because, as I think Congressman Liu said, in many ways this was a long time in coming, and yet we see no evidence that this decision by the Turks was met with any kind of contingency planning by the U.S. government. Instead, we have U.S. forces retreating under fire, withdrawing under fire for maybe the first time since Somalia, except that fire is coming from a NATO ally. And I think that if we all stop for a moment and let that sink in, it's really extraordinary. The consequences of the U.S. withdrawal, well, I worry that what we're going to see is a cascade effect in Syria. And obviously the report doesn't get into this because this is all relatively new, but it's based upon what we learned in the course of our briefings. My concern is now you'll see, and have seen already, Syrian Democratic forces moving north to meet the Turkish incursion and U.S. forces moving out of Syria. And this creates a vacuum in most of eastern Syria. And ISIS will use that vacuum to regroup and potentially to not just break out of prison, but to conduct attacks in Syrian cities, try to reconsolidate some of its control of territory. The SDF, as has already been noted, faced with this choice between Assad and the Turks, has chosen to make a deal with the Assad regime. And we've seen regime forces now move into eastern Syria. With regime forces come the Iranians and Russians. That raises the prospect of Iran linking its Syrian and Iraqi proxies in a way that will also perhaps prompt an expansion of Israeli airstrikes and thus an increase in the chance of outright conflict between the two. I think we'll also see security conditions deteriorate as the population is brutalized in eastern Syria, as it has been elsewhere in areas the regime has retaken. We may also see a breakout of al-Qaeda-linked groups from Idlib along that northern border corridor. There's still problems elsewhere in Syria which aren't linked necessarily explicitly to what's happening in the northeast. Those include things like Idlib, like the security that's deteriorating in other regime-held areas, the entrenchment of Iran in Syrian society, the stalled political process, and this shattering of international norms with no real justice or accountability, as Ms. Stroul was pointing to. So what does the United States need to do? And I'll just take a few seconds more, Mr. Chairman. In the Northeast, I think it is vital that we halt and or limit the Turkish incursion and press the Turks for humanitarian access, to sever their links to terrorist groups, and not to forcibly resettle Arab refugees in Kurdish areas or in areas that they're not from or don't want to go back to. It's important that we try to keep pressure on ISIS. I think that probably means trying to keep American troops in eastern Syria, if that's viable, and certainly keeping up the air campaign, airstrikes against both ISIS and al-Qaeda-linked groups. Also, it means ensuring that we hold on to the U.S. presence in Iraq, which has also come under pressure in recent months, both politically and also perhaps here in Washington. I think it's important we keep pressure on Iran by supporting Israeli airstrikes and by maintaining that garrison at Atanf, which I anticipate itself may now come under some pressure as Russians, Iranians, others try to sort of complete the withdrawal of American forces from Syria. And I think we'll need to see a diplomatic push to hold our anti-ISIS and our sort of anti-Assad coalition together, maintaining this policy of withholding economic reconstruction funds, imposing sanctions, and diplomatically isolating the Assad regime. Many of our allies may now be inclined to peel off of that coalition. Just in closing, our report warned that this was not a conflict that was over, that it remained dynamic, it remained dangerous. And I think that, unfortunately, recent events have borne that out. I think it's important now that we stop relinquishing our leverage and we start using that leverage. My fear is that we are not going to see an end to the endless wars as a result of recent decisions. We're going to find that American forces were actually sort of helping to keep the peace and stability there. And what will really contribute to endless conflict is that deterioration of American credibility throughout the region.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you, Ms. Stroul. We'll now begin the questioning. We're going to do that subject to the 5-minute rule. I will begin, followed by Mr. Wilson. Mr. Singh, I want to start with where you left off talking about American leverage. And Ms. Stroul, you laid out the 5 areas. And I just want to suggest, I want to ask you this question. If our actions over the past couple of weeks in Syria mean that we're at risk of a greater risk of terrorism, expanded number of refugees, Russia is stronger, Iran is stronger, that when you talk about international norms, which I think is too often left out of this, mass civilian homicide as a policy, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, targeting hospitals and schools, starvation, hasn't one of the international norms for decades been American leadership? And if in all 5 of these areas we are weaker, not to mention the fact that we have left our partner, the Kurds, to be slaughtered, then isn't that fundamental norm of American leadership and American influence challenged and weakened dramatically? What leverage do we have, Mr. Singh, is my question, after we take action like this?
Thank you, Congressman. I think we do have leverage. I mean, we remain obviously a very capable and powerful actor on the world stage. We have obviously this coalition that we put together to conduct airstrikes against ISIS. We have sanctions. We have withholding, as I said, of the economic reconstruction funding or diplomatic recognition of any settlement or of the Assad regime itself. But I do think, Congressman, that you make an important point about the role of American leadership, because I think that without the United States to sort of assemble an international coalition to put together these tools, not just our tools, but contributions from others, they won't do it themselves. They will say, look, the writing is on the wall. Assad has won. Russia is calling the shots here. And I think you'll see hedging strategies from those allies. We have generally exercised that leadership, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, because we have always found it to be in our interest to do so, to be the ones setting out the initiatives and having others hopefully sign up to those initiatives. And second, because we have worried about the vacuum that's created in the absence of that leadership and who might step in. And I think those who step in are other states, weaker states, frankly, like Russia, like Iran, who lack the ability to challenge us directly except when we back off. And then non-state actors who, in certain areas where there frankly is no government, no authority, step in and provide some of that themselves in ways which are quite destructive.
I agree, and on the issue of weaker states with more power, Ms. Stroul, how does providing Assad and Iran a freer hand in Syria undermine the administration's maximum pressure policy that had been our policy and apparently continues to be, notwithstanding where we stand?
The Syria Study Group, The Syria Study Group talked about sanctions to some extent being successful in denying Iran the opportunity to consolidate its gains in Syria, but on its own, a sanctions-only policy combined with Israeli target kinetic strikes was not sufficient to remove Iran or eliminate Iranian influence from Syria. I want to return to just what Mr. Singh was discussing in your first question as well. The reason the Syria Study Group talked about needing to retain a U.S. military presence in that one-third of Syria was not only about completing the anti-ISIS fight, it was about the broader leverage of that one-third of Syria, which is the resource-rich part of Syria, which provided us leverage to influence the political outcome in Syria. While anything in terms of U.S. leadership is going to be much more difficult going forward, there are three categories of leverage that still, if properly resourced, and the State Department and our diplomats are empowered to lead a coalition, potentially provide some leverage to us. The first is Reconstruction. Russia and Iran simply do not have the financing to reconstruct Syria. So even if Assad regains control of that one-third of Syria, he does not have the resources and his backers do not have the resources to construct and provide economic stability or security for those areas. That comes through the United States, Europe, and access to international financial institutions. Right now, that remains relevant. Sanctions. Many other governments are at this point contemplating whether or not to go back into Damascus, especially as we see what happens with Assad on the ground. But the risk of secondary sanctions and what it means to materially support the Assad regime and his backers now remains a possible and potent form of leverage if we apply it smartly now. And finally, political recognition. We still have leadership with the Europeans and with international organizations to deny political recognition and international legitimacy to Assad, and that still remains relevant today.
Before I turn it over to Mr. Wilson, I will respectfully suggest, and we'll see how the rest of this discussion goes, that I acknowledge what you're saying. It feels, though you wrote it only weeks ago, it feels like it's from another time when you talk about properly resourced decisions on reconstruction and sanctions and political recognition, all based on American leadership. When you talk about America being a powerful actor on the world stage, that is true. We are a less powerful actor when we leave our partners open to slaughter, the partners that we have relied upon to help us and in this very difficult battle against ISIS. That's why this feels so problematic. But I'm sure we'll get into this more. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, it is a bipartisan concern about everything we're discussing today. It's quite obvious that in a bipartisan manner, we're all concerned. And that's why we appreciate so much both of you leading the effort for the study and providing the study, and Ms. Stroul and Mr. Singh, for each of you. The events of the past weekend have been really completely upended our counter-ISIS strategy. What should we do to have the strategy to address what's occurred in the last week? And beginning with Ms. Stroul.
We still haven't, the U.S. forces presence on the ground in Syria was not, we were not fighting ISIS directly. We were working through a partner, but we were also collecting intelligence, and we had a large air campaign as well. We don't have to abandon the air campaign. Our coalition partners in the Defeat ISIS coalition the coalition has not collapsed yet. And I would add that the anti-ISIS coalition has many elements, not just military force on the ground. There was also a counter-terror financing element. There's humanitarian aid. There's working on countering ISIS propaganda and its global ideological appeal. These are still things that we can work on. And at the end of the day, Turkey is still our NATO ally, and they have said that they are going to accept responsibility for the rest of the Defeat ISIS campaign. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that's very problematic, but at this point, they are still our partner in the NATO alliance. And if while we need to right now think about what tools we can compel to shape Turkish actions and prevent destructive Turkish actions that can cause the next cycle of conflict, there may be still areas where we can work with them if we can get to a ceasefire on going forward with the anti-ISIS campaign.
So I agree with that. We have to the extent we can, use the tools that we have, whether it's airstrikes, frankly, whether it's keeping some forces in Syria, which I think is not something we should take off the table or assume is not possible now. We need to examine whether that is in fact viable in current circumstances. We need to keep that pressure on, and not just ISIS, but there's groups like HTS, like Haras ad-Din, who probably will benefit from this situation as well, because now there's this corridor created along the Turkish-Syrian border, which might allow them to escape Idlib, where they're currently sort of holed up, and spread into other areas of Syria. And Haras ad-Din in particular is committed to external plotting, and so we need to pay attention to that. There is also, though, this risk, and President Trump has talked about it quite explicitly, of ISIS members now exfiltrating Syria to places like Europe. And so there's an intelligence and a CT task that comes along with that as well. And so I think it's important that we work very closely to the extent we can, given the state of the relationship, with the Turks, with other countries along the borders, with Europe, on making sure that we're tracking that, finding those folks, arresting them if possible, encountering them as well. I think all of this is more difficult now in the circumstances we're in because, again, as Dana was saying, part of the reason we had those forces there was to sort of enable other activities in eastern Syria to promote stability and good governance, which really would have been necessary to keep ISIS from reemerging. It already was reemerging before this. Now it looks like those missions just won't be possible in the current environment, and that is going to sort of reduce our CT effectiveness.
I'd like to thank both of you because I was really concerned we were in a hopeless situation, but indeed we're not. And we should always remember that Turkey, as a member of NATO for 70 years, has been such a valued ally. And the Turkish people, their relationship to the American people has been so strong. It's just shocking to see whatever divisions are occurring now that I believe will be just temporary. On another note, the United Nations has different associations with the Assad dictatorship. From each of you, what is your view about the relationship of the Assad regime with the UN organizations?
The United Nations and the various organizations that have been providing humanitarian assistance inside Syria have received much criticism for acquiescing to the manner in which the Assad regime would like that assistance to be delivered to communities inside Syria. Our report highlights a very important Security Council resolution coming up for renewal at the end of the year, the cross-border resolution, which provides the international underpinning for the United Nations to enter into areas of Syria without the Assad regime acquiescing specifically to it. Without that cross-border resolution, all humanitarian aid delivered by the United Nations inside Syria would be subject to Assad regime approval, which means that delivery of that assistance and provision would be weaponized and politicized to suit Assad's purposes.
And my time is up, but thank both of you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I will recognize myself for now for 5 minutes. I just want to thank you both for your work. I'm sure it must be frustrating to have finished these recommendations and to immediately thereafter have these events come up. The Syria Study Group was put together to develop comprehensive and thoughtful policy for the future. But President Trump has instead acted on a whim, and in doing so has thrown our allies under the bus, I think has emboldened our enemies, and I am deeply, deeply concerned about this. And of course, you've seen today with the vote that we just took how bipartisan that rejection has been. I'm most concerned, I want to ask you first about the reputational damage that has been done. You might have seen the same comments I have seen from the SDF saying this is a stab in the back. Why would anyone ally with us going forward? And your comments about what we can do and the leverage we may still maintain seems to me that it relies on the fact that anyone would believe our word at all, which I find to be quite suspect right now.
So I think it's a valid concern, Congressman, this question of what will the broader reputational or sort of credibility damage be to the United States. And we have already seen other allies who are not necessarily heavily engaged with this issue suggest that this does raise questions about our reliability. I think we saw some of that from some commentators from the region. Some British MPs have raised this question of, does Britain now need to sort of play a stronger role in some of these conflicts? Look, I would say that we want other states, of course, to step up and play greater roles in some of these conflicts, and burden sharing is something we can all agree on. But we don't want them to do it.
I don't think we wanted it to be this way.
We don't want them to do it because they don't think they can rely on the United States, or because they view the United States as unpredictable, because my worry is that that won't produce sort of strong allied coalitions that are pursuing strategies that advance American interests. It will produce things like hedging behavior, where they reach out to adversaries of the United States, whether that's the Russians in this particular theater, China in other theaters, because they sort of view that as something they need to do for their own national security. So I think that even if we decide we are going to intervene less, we are going to try to push others to share burdens, still you want to be doing whatever we're doing around the world in sort of a multilateral way as part of a coalition, rather than sort of simply sort of retreating to Fortress America, as it were, and saying to other countries, you're on your own.
Ms. Stroul, before you address the same question, I want you to also specifically note the people in this region and how a message like this will be delivered and heard in this region, because we're talking about great powers, our allies, the UK, the Russians, the Iranians, but how do you, in your assessment, having done this work now for months, how will this affect the Kurds, the SDF, the people on the ground who we may hope to be able to work with?
Thank you for that question. One of the things the Syria Study Group did over the course of our work was travel throughout the region. We could not go inside Syria, but we went to Turkey and Jordan and Israel and Lebanon. And what was striking, I led a delegation to Turkey and Lebanon, was that much of the damage to U.S. credibility and leadership had already been done from last December 2018, when there was the first attempt to withdraw U.S. forces without much of a plan guiding it or much consultation with either our local partners, the SDF, or our neighbors and other partners in the coalition. So in general, most of the discussions we had, whether with outside experts in these countries, with government counterparts, with humanitarian activists in these in the region, generally already doubted whether the United States had the commitment and staying power to follow through on what we said we were going to do. And when it comes to the Kurds, very much the same thing. I think a lot of the damage had already been done. We were very clear, if you look at U.S. official talking points, that our relationship with the SDF was temporary and transactional. And even though no one expected the relationship to change the way it did over such a short period of time, they understood what temporary and tactical meant, which is why they were always talking to everybody else anyway. So over the entire course of our relationship with the SDF, they maintained communications with Damascus. They always talked to the Russians. They'll talk to whoever can do anything to ensure their survival.
Thank you. I will yield to Mr. Kinzinger from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for both being here and your good work. And I'm sad. And I'm also, the report is frustrating to me, not because it's a bad report, it's a good report, but because of how quickly everything's changed. But I don't want you to think that your work's useless. I think someday it will be a very studied report, and you will look at how history went and how it could have gone and recommendations to prevent it as we WTF this whole thing, looking back in history. A couple things I want to address before I get into the meat of my questions. I was looking, I was being pretty nostalgic about Reagan lately. And I remember a quote, it's, "Let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender." And I saw a tweet by the president the other day where he talked about peace and creating peace, and we're creating peace everywhere. And I'll tell you, if you surrender and leave, you can create temporary peace for yourself. But I don't think that's the mission of our country. I mean, when you look at the post-World War II order, when we finally realized that isolationism didn't work until we had this strain of weird isolationism that kind of came back into our body politic. But in that history, when we won the Second World War, we inherited the basically industrial capacity of Germany and Japan, and we had this massive industrial revolution, which we all look back on today and we talk about in the economy, bringing manufacturing back. And that was a result not of American isolationism, but of actually America being involved in the world. And when we turn the post-World War II order on its head, I think the consequences are really difficult to see in the short term, but we're able to see an immediate result of that in the decision made the other day. Now, I want to compare that quote of Reagan to one that was just made. Our soldiers are out of there. Our soldiers are totally safe. Syria may have some help with Russians, and that's fine. It's a lot of sand. They've got a lot of sand over there, so there's a lot of sand that they could play with. It's a real difference in leadership styles, to put it quite politely. This idea of war fatigue that I hear people talk about really ticks me off too. Yes, you're tired of seeing it on television. In Congress, we probably are tired of talking about it. It's been happening for a long time. But if anybody had a right to be war fatigued, it was my grandparents after World War II. And what happened is America, instead of leaving Europe and saying it's a lot of destroyed property, America said we're going to stay. And 3 generations of Americans staying there, finally the 3rd generation behind the Iron Curtain, tore it down because they were desperate for a taste of what we had. And there's a whole world that's basically free right now because of that. 50 soldiers were preventing an invasion by Turkey. And I want to be very clear, anybody that believes that 50 soldiers that Turkey would have attacked if the president said, we will defend our soldiers with the might of the U.S. military, you are fooling yourself. Because Turkey never would have been that stupid. It would have been a short fight. Nobody wants to fight a NATO ally, me especially. But I do want a president that's going to stand up for American positions, and this is weakness. And I think there's no other way to put it. Instead of turning out away from the world, now, we're spending a lot of time in Congress just fighting each other like we're enemies because we're like drama queens and we have to be addicted to drama, so we got to fight somebody, and so we just argue here. We can't get anything done, and we forget that there's a real enemy out there that wants to destroy us. So, Mr. Singh, let me just ask you a question. And when it comes to Turkey, I introduced today the United States-Turkey Relations Review Act. It's a bipartisan bill with Mr. Cicilline, and it would require the administration to review U.S.-Turkish relations and report it to Congress, the feasibility of relocating American personnel and assets from Incirlik, because this is going to be a big problem, the air base there. But let me ask you, Mr. Singh, the president said that his chief campaign promise was to defeat ISIS. It wasn't end endless wars. That's new. It was defeat ISIS. He said he's going to stay in Syria as long as Iran is doing their nefarious activity there. Has Iran withdrawn their support of the Assad regime? And if not, what kind of support does Tehran still send Damascus?
Thank you, Congressman. No, Iran has absolutely not withdrawn its support for the Assad regime. We see the Iranians sending not only their own forces. You do have Revolutionary Guard Corps officers, for example, in Syria. But we see them cultivating and sometimes sending over proxies. Hezbollah, some Afghani and Pakistani forces have been there, as well as Syrian forces who they themselves have recruited and organized and paid. But we also see Iran really sort of entrenching itself in the economic and social fabric of Syria, which tells you that they're there to stay. Iran would be turning Syria into sort of a forward operating base for its missiles and other power projection tools if it weren't for Israeli airstrikes, which have effectively stopped them from doing that. But the Israelis themselves would tell you that those airstrikes have stopped Iran from engaging in certain activities, but they haven't deterred Iran from continuing to sort of focus on Syria as a power projection base.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, guys. I want to completely associate myself with Mr. Kinzinger's remarks from start to finish. First of all, you did a fantastic job, and I wish you were here under circumstances that were different. But here we are. We've had maybe 2.5 years in which there was such a thing as the Trump administration that was resisting Trump, and I don't think there is an administration anymore. We have a president who's acting on his impulses. And the policy of the United States right now is that Syria is not our problem. That's what he said. There's just a bunch of sand, and they can all play in their sand. It is now the official policy of the United States that Russia hates ISIS as much as the U.S. does, and that the PKK is a bigger threat than ISIS. These are all things that the president said today. Anyone who wants to assist Syria in protecting the Kurds is good with me. Russia, China, Napoleon Bonaparte. This is our policy, and we know the second, third, fourth order consequences can be catastrophic. I'm a bit less worried right now about Turkey massacring the Kurds because we know what's happened. The Kurds have struck their alliance with the Assad regime and with the Russians, and that will provide some protection. I'm more worried about the Assad regime now moving into eastern and northern Syria, which is populated not just by Kurds. I'm worried about the inevitability, I think, of Turkey now deciding that in order to deal with its security problems, it no longer has any interest in dealing with us because it's not our problem. They're going to be dealing with the Russians and with Iran. We saw Putin was in the UAE and Saudi Arabia telling them, I'm sure we know what he was saying, you can't trust the United States, but I have some things that I will offer to you, and you know that I will act in defense of our interests. And I think worst of all, he's a step closer to getting the world he wants, a world with no values, no norms, no rules, a world where powerful countries and leaders can do what they want to whomever they want. America, you go do your thing, Russia can do its thing. And that makes me incredibly sad, and I wonder what can we do about it. And I'm struggling with certain things. One question is, do we as a Congress push for maintaining some troops in Syria? I have a bipartisan bill that was relevant a few days ago. I don't know if it's still relevant. It basically says you can't go below 1,000 in Syria unless you can report back to the Congress the answers to certain obvious questions, the questions we've been talking about here. Is that still a relevant approach? And I'd also like to ask you both about our relationship with Turkey. There's a lot of sentiment right now that we need to punish Turkey hard for what it did, and I hate what Turkey did. It was despicable. But I also worry a little bit that we are obsessing right now over punishment of Turkey because we want to absolve ourselves of a decision that President Trump made, and frankly, to be nonpartisan here, to absolve ourselves of mistakes that we made in the Obama administration as well. It's very convenient to say that this is all now the fault of one country that did a terrible thing rather than looking at ourselves. And so I wonder what your advice would be on those two questions. On troops, is there something the Congress can and should do? And on Turkey, is it actually wise to sanction Turkey severely for doing something that the President told them that they could do? If we are ceding the Middle East to Russia, is it in our interest really to pull out of Incirlik now and potentially cede a NATO ally to Russia as well? What should we do?
So thank you, Congressman. I think they're both very relevant questions right now. I would say that, look, had we negotiated a security mechanism or safe zone with Turkey, which Ambassador Jeffrey was in the process of doing right before the decision to end that and to withdraw, presumably we would have taken our troops and perhaps moved them south. We would have continued activities south of that buffer zone or security zone. And so, in theory, there isn't a reason we can't do that now. My question would be, because security for American forces was largely being provided by the SDF, we had a very small number of troops, as you know, Congressman, working with the SDF. If the SDF itself has left these areas and the regime has moved in, is there really an environment in which we can work? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it is a question that Congress has to ask DOD and get a clear answer to, hopefully in the days to come. On the question of Turkey, look, I think that we need to recognize, as many of you already have, that the seeds of this crisis were sown when we made this decision to work with the YPG Kurdish militia, knowing that it was considered a grave security threat by Turkey. We apparently, as you said, Congressman, gave Turkey the green light to do this. So the administration has said that we didn't, but it doesn't seem like there was opposition to the idea. I think we have to take these things into account in our response to Turkey. My own view is that we should be now trying to shape Turkish actions, using sanctions or the threat of sanctions, not to punish Turkey, but to try to lay down sort of some conditions or red lines for Turkey, whether it's humanitarian access, whether it's limiting their incursion, whether it's, again, severing their links with some of these extremist proxies that they seem to be using. And if we do need to use sanctions, to use them in a way which is sufficiently strong that it will cause Turkey to really reconsider some of these actions. There is, I think, this overall question now hanging over the U.S.-Turkish relationship, especially because of Turkey's apparent targeting of U.S. troops. That's not behavior which is sort of compatible with this NATO alliance that we have. And so I think there will be a long-term cost, for sure, to the U.S.-Turkish relationship. But in the sort of the near-term question of sanctions, I would say use them to shape, not punish.
The Syria Study Group spent a long time thinking about the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and I would just like to highlight and underscore what we did say. We did not call for severing the relationship with Turkey. We acknowledged the links between the PKK, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization in Turkey, and the YPG element of the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria. And we acknowledged that U.S. support for the SDF was a major irritant in the U.S.-Turkey relationship. We did not call for severing the U.S. relationship with the SDF at this time, and we also did not say that Turkey offered a viable alternative military force to continue the anti-ISIS fight, if not for the U.S. relationship with the SDF. So there were very clear things that we said. At this point, could the threat of sanctions shape some Turkish behavior that would otherwise be very destabilizing? For example, the forcible relocation of certain refugees into areas that are not their homes in Syria. There's reports of atrocities and war crimes being committed by proxies, Turkish-supported proxies. These are things that, well, I don't know the content of the president's phone call with President Erdogan. Clearly, these are things that sanctions may be able to shape. So I would leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Reschenthal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the last decade, Syria has been ground zero for a devastating proxy war. The country presents some of the most pressing humanitarian and national security challenges that our nation faces. It's essential that the United States maintain a strong footprint abroad. All right, I'm not sure what's going on with my mic. All right, it is essential the United States maintain a strong footprint abroad. And as history has shown, when the United States turns its back, chaos erupts, and our enemies fill that power vacuum. It's refreshing to hear my colleagues across the aisle have concern over Syria and present a position of having a strong U.S. presence abroad. I wish I would have seen this kind of vigor in these positions when President Obama allowed Assad to ignore a red line. And I would hope that this newfound vigor in these new positions transfer when speaking about Venezuela, about defending the Hong Kongers, and others that are seeking liberty and freedom from across the world. But I applaud the new positions that my colleagues across the aisle have found, and I also applaud President Trump's continued actions to hold the Syrian regime in check by attacking military targets after its chemical attack on civilians, and for imposing sanctions on officials in Assad's authoritarian government. I also commend the president's swift actions in Turkey, whose irrational actions have endangered a key U.S. ally, empowered Iran and Assad, and set us back in the global fight against ISIS. These are not the actions of a NATO ally, and I'm proud to co-sponsor a sweeping sanction bill introduced by Republican Conference Chairwoman Liz Cheney. With that said, I have two questions for the witnesses. First, on August 25th, the Israeli Air Force acted in Syria to prevent an Iranian drone attack on Israel. What does the report recommend related to the U.S. support for allies confronting threats from Syria, in particular Israel?
Thanks, Congressman. Well, the Israeli campaign against Iran, I think if you step back, is really extraordinary in many ways, because they have managed to sort of deter, maybe not deter, they've managed to limit Iran's activities in Syria through these airstrikes, and yet Iran has not had an effective response against Israel. And they've managed to do this in coordination with Russia, which is in this alliance with Iran. And so I think that the Israeli campaign really sort of deserves commendation. And we should support it however we can, whether that's intelligence sharing, whether that's diplomatic cover if they need it. And we should also, frankly, use our own tools to counter what Iran is doing, you know, sanctions tools and whatever other tools are available to us.
I associate myself with Mr. Singh's comments.
All right, you guys are making it easy. All right, one more question. How do we ensure the situation on the border between northeast Syria and Turkey is not abused by Iran to expand its presence in the country and solidify what I'm seeing as a land bridge between Tehran and Beirut?
So this is where Mr. Singh talked earlier about the U.S. forces that remain at the Tanf garrison, which is not in the area of northeastern Syria that Turkey is currently focused on. So in the view of the Syria Study Group, maintaining those U.S. forces at that garrison is critical for preventing Iran from consolidating those lines of communication through Syria. And given the movement or redeployment of other U.S. forces, it's highly likely that Assad, Russia, the Iranians or Iran proxies will challenge our position there. They've done it before, and that was under former Secretary of Defense Mattis, who responded with overwhelming force and sent a clear signal. So this would, in terms of maintaining that U.S. force presence, our adversaries need to believe that there's a credible threat of military force on the table, and that's something that hopefully the executive branch will be contemplating of making quite clear.
All right, thank you again. I commend you on your work, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Richtenthaler. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank the witnesses here today. I remember the first time I had the opportunity to meet the Kurds as a group. It was former Congress members Darrell Issa and John Micah and I. We traveled to Baghdad, then we traveled, and there we were briefed by our embassy and also military personnel. Then we went up to Erbil. In Erbil, we met with the Kurd leadership there. Then we met with the military arm, the Peshmerga. And during that time, it was interesting because our military and our special forces in particular told us how we were allied with the Kurds there and how, in fact, they were doing very heavy fighting alongside of us, and we could trust them, and how they were our allies and our friends. From them, of course, I heard of the situation in Syria also. Of course, two different areas, but very similar, they said, was the situation. And so anyway, I came away thinking that we were allies, we could be trusted by them, and they be trusted by us. And what has happened here recently, I think, is a disaster, a terrible disaster. And to listen to some of the military personnel, our military, to say how they're ashamed of what we've done is particularly devastating when you think of how our military each and every day put their lives on the line, or out there fighting with those that expect to have their backs and we their backs. It's been sad. But that being said, I am very nervous about the Kurds now in Syria, in particular ethnic cleansing. I know that they're trying to cut deals now with Assad, and it's like trying to cut a deal with a snake. You know, what assures them that they won't be wiped out? I say this, for 2 years we had a family of Kosovars live with us because of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So I'm very familiar with that, and I want to know what can we do, what can be done so these Kurds aren't wiped out as we saw the atrocities already happening. What can we do?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's a valid concern. You know, we could be concerned about this on, frankly, both sides of the sort of Turkish line of advance, right? Because we have not really had insight into what's been happening in the other Turkish-occupied enclaves of Syria, the Afrin and Euphrates Shield pockets. And so one thing that we will want from the Turks, you know, if we're going to go there and try to talk to them, if we're going to be threatening them with sanctions, is we will want transparency and humanitarian access into any zone they occupy to ensure that these things aren't happening, whether it's at the hands of Turkish authorities or probably more likely at the hands of some of these extremist proxies who we've seen up to no good in recent days. On the other side of that line, I think it's even more challenging because obviously the Assad regime has brutalized the populations in areas that it has reoccupied, and so too have Russian and Iranian-backed forces. And I think they will view the SDF fighters and officers as a threat to the Assad regime's reconsolidation of that rule. So I think it's going to take things like not just sanctions, but one of the things we talk about in the report is we should be willing to threaten the Assad regime with the use of force if it is deliberately targeting groups for war crimes and atrocities and so forth. It shouldn't necessarily be the case that that type of response is only used when, say, chemical weapons are used. I think the Assad regime, Iran, they need to understand that we're watching and that there are going to be consequences for war crimes, for atrocities, for ethnic cleansing, as you said, Congressman.
Ms. Rahn.
I agree with what Mr. Singh said, and I would only add that when it comes to the Kurdish communities in Syria, they never put all their eggs in the American basket. For them, this is about survival. Whether that survival is no autonomy and no integration of the force structure that they created into Assad's army, which has been one of their requests, or desire for Kurdish cultural rights and language in schools. But if Assad with Russia can guarantee their survival or provide a security guarantee that the United States will not, and faced between Turkish operations which could result in ethnic cleansing or demographic reengineering, like we've seen in places like Afrin or the Euphrates Shield area, versus subjugation to Damascus, they're going to pick Damascus. And then the next level of questions for the United States is, what does our policy look like, or our approach to Syria look like, if our former partner is working with Damascus and Russia?
Well, my time is up, but I do want to say that I think it's very important then to have this transparency and this humanitarian access, because I don't think anything good is going to come from this, anything at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Trone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The main point of the report is that Russia and Iran, they share many interests when it comes to involvement with Syria. Both are looking for increased regional influence, and they've got a willing partner now in Assad. The withdrawal of the U.S. counterterrorism efforts directly enables Russia and Iran to be more enmeshed and exert greater influence. What concrete steps would the U.S. need to take, given the recent events, to combat the outsized Russian and Iranian influence in the region? Is it even feasible?
We spent a lot of time debating in the Syria Study Group whether or not what unites Russia and Iran in backing Assad were there areas of tension or fracture that we could exploit to break that alliance apart and then provide us some opportunities via a political process, our own leverage or military operations to then move forward. Our conclusion is that Russia and Iran have more in common, and both have the goal of keeping the United States out. And unfortunately, recent developments probably only solidify for them that their alliance and their backing of Assad is working.
So you found no divisions of interest at all?
There's certainly tensions about security force activities, where certain security forces operate, whether or not behavior of the Assad regime could be modified. For example, Russia is a member of the UN Security Council and would probably like to enable some sort of political process that could fold Assad back into the international community. Iran is a pariah state, not in the international community in that sense, so probably doesn't share that same objective. But again, our conclusion at the end of the day was that there was more unifying Russia and Iran, specifically in their opposition to the United States, and minimizing U.S. leadership in the region.
Okay, so what does the Syria Study Group recommend regarding Iran's presence, in Syria, assuming you believe Iran should not maintain a military presence in Syria? What recommendations do you have to achieve that goal?
Well, Congressman, if you look at the report, we have some recommendations, largely which sort of focus on things like exposing Iran's role in Syria, because a lot of what Iran is doing is not of a kind of overt military nature. A lot of that is very much in the news because you see the Israeli airstrikes, for example, against Iranian missiles and things like that. But there's this economic and sort of social element to it as well. And I think that activity doesn't get sufficiently exposed. I think we should have a greater effort to sort of put it into the sunlight, as it were. But I would also encourage us not to think of what Iran is doing in Syria as somehow an isolated issue that we have to respond to just there. one of my concerns is, we now have still a very significant presence across the Middle East, but there's a lot of people who are questioning our commitment to that presence. And I think that's actually a dangerous position to be in. We've seen the Iranians escalate regionally, their attacks on tankers, reportedly this attack on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia. I think this adds even more importance to the idea that we need to respond to those types of Iranian escalations, lest they look at this Syria decision and say, hey, where else can we press on the United States to sort of get them out of other places in the region we don't want them, right? So I think it's important that we look at this from a regional perspective and not just a Syria-specific perspective.
So they look upon us as an easy mark.
Okay, I mean, if we had the Carter Doctrine in 1980 and then the Reagan Corollary, right, which said that we had we saw a vital interest in the Gulf, for example, and we were willing to defend that interest militarily. But we didn't at the time have a heavy presence in the region. And now, again, we have the opposite, right? We have basically said that we're not sure we see a vital interest for the United States. President Trump has said he's not sure he sees a vital interest for the United States, whether it's with tanker traffic in the Gulf or here in Syria. And yet the presence, the U.S. military presence, is much, much larger than it was at the time of, say, the Carter Doctrine. And again, this kind of asymmetry, heavy presence but maybe receding commitment, I do fear will embolden or encourage adversaries like Iran to try to take shots at us.
Quickly, the Russian has now, force have indicated, entered northeast Syria with our withdrawal. What's Russia's objective there in the region, and how will it respond to Turkey's incursion?
Russia's objective in Syria is to take back all of Syrian territory under Assad, to deliver a win for Assad, not just militarily on the ground, but politically. So what the Russians want is not just full consolidation of territorial control, but reconstruction, return of refugees, and international legitimacy for the Assad regime.
And I'll just say, Congressman, that I think that what they also want is to just deal defeat to the United States. And as I'm one who would like to say that we don't need to have a zero-sum approach to Russia. Not everything Russia does is inherently threatening to the United States. I would like to be able to say that maybe Syria is a place in ideal conditions where you could find room to agree or cooperate with Russia. But I think that's just not the case, because I think Moscow doesn't see it that way. I think Moscow sort of wants to show the rest of the region, again, that the United States is not reliable. They want to thwart what they see as kind of a regime change effort by the United States. They want to paint our policy in those terms. And they're not, I think, interested in sort of win-win solutions and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. And finally, Ms. Jackson-Lee has joined us here today, and without objection, I'm happy to recognize her for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me acknowledge the chairman and the ranking member for their courtesies. This is a committee that I used to be on, and I have a great affection and respect for all of the leadership of the committee. I happen to serve on the Homeland Security Committee and a subcommittee of crime and terrorism, so it intermingles with what I think is crucial is diplomacy and the work that you've done. Let me applaud you for the work. I went to Syria many years before 2011 and went to Damascus and spoke to the then new and fresh Assad, of which some thought there might be a difference. To my dismay, there was zero difference from his father, but in another era. I want to pose these questions, and as I do so, let me just read this statement from an Army officer who formerly served. I can't look at the atrocities an Army officer who served in Syria last year said of videos posted online of Turkish-backed fighters executing Kurdish civilians. The ISIS mission is going to stop. ISIS is going to have a resurgence, and we're going to have to go back in 5 years and do it all over again. Now, I want you to comment on that, but I do want you, first of all, you're obviously doing your study, but what is your assessment, or maybe people who you met are calling you about the sheer violence and loss of life, particularly among, because remember when the conflict first started, and there were Doctors Without Borders, and the United States was in, we were seeing just a sheer miserable violence that the Syrian people were going through. Certainly the Kurds have taken their share, but help us understand how deep the violence is, how children are impacted, maybe from your discussions that you had or people calling you. Thank you. Thank you to both of you as co-chairs.
Thank you so much for that question. We consulted broadly with humanitarian and human rights activists and organizations, as well as the Syrian American community and those organizations that are collecting evidence, documenting evidence of atrocities, abuses, and war crimes. What we heard consistently from all of these communities and individuals was a plea for the United States to prioritize issues of civilian protection, and a perception that that has not been a front and center policy priority of the United States. Many asked us to recommend that the United States make very clear its willingness to use military force in response to civilian casualties and the sheer mass homicide tactics of the Assad regime, that it's not just chemical weapons, but barrel bombs, medical sieges, starvation, forced disappearances, torture, et cetera, and that these issues are not front and center and not talked about enough in U.S.-led situations, and that gives the perception that we don't care about those issues.
And you would think that it is now exacerbated in light of where we are today, violence, decapitation, et cetera?
The perception that President Trump greenlit a Turkish operation in which we've seen Turkish-backed forces firing on civilians, ISIS detainees escaping from prisons, and the discussion that there will be involuntary resettlement of Syrian refugees into areas that are not historically where they come from, all send the signal that issues of civilian protection are not a priority of the United States.
Let me continue. You mentioned the fact that at the time, the conflict was not winding down, and you called it dynamic and dangerous. How dangerous is it now in light of the actions of the president that allowed Turkey to come in without restraint and killing without restraint?
So I think, Congresswoman, that it is, in fact, quite dangerous now, more dangerous now than it was before, in large part because you will now have potentially ISIS breaking out of prisons. You'll have a reduction in the counterterrorism pressure on ISIS, as well as some of these other jihadist groups. You may have an expansion of Iran into eastern Syria, and as I said, sort of a linking of the Syrian and Iraqi proxies of Iran, and perhaps an expansion of the war that's taken place between Israel and Iran over these issues. And to the sort of very first part of your question, Congresswoman, about the U.S. military operation, you know, I think that this lumping of Syria into the endless wars category has been incorrect, frankly. I think that if you were opposed to the U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003, or if you were skeptical about our military presence in Afghanistan, in a way you should be pleased by the way the intervention in Syria has been conducted, because you've had a very small American military footprint rallying a 60 to 70,000 strong partner force, and that partner force out front really doing the bulk of the work and the fighting, and U.S. forces really playing an advisory role. And I think that the U.S. military has considered that to be a very significant success and perhaps even a model for future interventions. And it is a shame that sort of we have now relinquished a lot of those gains which that model was able to deliver. And you know, I think that, again, to put it together in this kind of endless war category is a big mistake, and I don't think that's how folks see it in the government.
I know my time is expired. Mr. Chairman, if I could just squeeze in this national security question, if I might. In the report, it says the liberation of ISIS-held territory does not eliminate the group's threat to the United States, which this was in your report. We now have a circumstance of a free-for-all Turkish fighter jets. We have bombing, fleeing, and you already indicated in your report preceding this how dangerous, and let me just for the record put on my dismay, Mr. Chairman, of 2,000 troops in Saudi Arabia, and troops that wanted to stay and were being effective in Syria are now being, and I want to use the term imploded, they're just being scattered, I mean U.S. troops. And I think, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that we might have had a success that we could have modeled after. Few number of soldiers, but they were a powerful statement. But your assessment now of the level of a national security threat that this region may be in light of where we are in the aftermath of Turkish actions?
So even though ISIS has been pushed out of the territory that it holds, its command and control, its leadership structure is still in place. It still has the ability to raise funds. Now those 2,000 foreign fighters that were in detention facilities under SDF control, not to mention the thousands of Syrian and Iraqi fighters that were in detention, are likely not going to remain in detention for much longer, which means the ranks of ISIS will be replenished, access to finances, global brand appeal, plus leadership. We still have Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, giving speeches that end up on the internet talking about its plan for waging a long-term war. So I would say the national security threat is very high, and ISIS
Very, I didn't hear you. Very.
It is high.
Very high.
ISIS still retains the means and the desire to use territory in Syria to plan external attacks.
Congressman, I would just add just a couple of specifics to this. You know, President Trump criticized our European partners a lot for not repatriating their own citizens among the ISIS fighters. There were a couple thousand foreign fighters. And he was right to do so, frankly. But I think, you know, the irony is that the way things have now developed over the last few days, this process of repatriation, which requires visits to the camps and kind of consular work, is now essentially impossible to do. So even if folks are kind of remaining contained within this area, getting to them to sort of bring them out and sort of put them into a judicial process of some kind or a national security process is going to be impossible. Another question would be, to what extent were we able to have completed the process of, say, cataloging the fighters who were in these camps? Do we know who was there and who now may sort of be on the loose? My understanding, and we talk about this in the report, is that was ongoing. I don't know if it was finished before this decision was taken or not, and that might be a question to ask the government.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One military person, as I close, called this a real mess. I think he was being more than delicate or polite. I am appalled at where we are today, and I think you have done us a good service, but you've also emphasized that the national security threat is heightened, and we created this mess. And I hope that maybe Congress can work together to try to bring some aid, comfort, and redesign of where we are today. Mr. Chairman, your committee is very important in this, and I thank you for allowing me to be here.
Mr. Jackson-Lee, thank you for being here. Thank you for your contribution to our committee today. Appreciate it. And finally, Mr. Sherman, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and I would note to other members who may be on their way that we have a hard stop at 4:30. So, Mr. Sherman, you have time and you're recognized.
The Turks are relying to a significant extent on these Arab tribal militias. To what extent is Turkey relying on them, and to what extent are they ideologically simpatico with ISIS?
Thank you, Congressman. So I'm not sure they're tribal militias. I think that
they've been described that way, but okay.
If you look at who they are, they're probably composed of some people who were refugees, displaced persons from other parts of Syria. Some of them may be former ISIS or other sort of members of other jihadist
or Al-Qaeda,
groups,
yeah,
or other sort of the rebel groups. I mean, there were over 1,000 of these different rebel factions in Syria in the past, and so some of them have probably made their way into these groups who are now fighting at Turkey's behest. I can't tell you to what extent sort of Turkey's relying on them versus its own forces. I just don't have that information. But clearly, if you look at what we see in the open sources, it does seem as though there is a very heavy component of these sort of Arab proxies being used by the Turks.
And to how, to what extent are these groups that have similar ideology to either Al-Qaeda or ISIS?
Over the course of 8 years of conflict in Syria, there are no longer groups that we would describe as moderate. We tried to support moderate forces. We called them the Free Syrian Army. That support no longer happened, and a lot of it was because many of those fighters that we wished to work with would not meet U.S. vetting standards in terms of what their affiliations were. I would also note that a lot
I would point out the Kurds qualify as moderates.
Congress put in place very serious vetting standards before the U.S. could provide assistance and equipping, so I assume that before U.S. forces provided that support to the SDF, those fighters and units met U.S. vetting standards. And I would also add that a lot of the forces and militias that the Turks appear to be working with, there's been some good work done by other individuals trying to study what their motivations are. A lot of it at this point is criminality. There's not much left for your average Syrian to do. There's no economy, there's no economic opportunity. So some of this is ideological or unsavory types that certainly the United States would identify as violent extremist organizations and affiliations. And on the other hand, there are criminals and thugs that are working on behalf of the Turks.
Let's see. So how far do you expect Turkey to go into the region? Is it going to limit themselves to 70 miles to the 70 kilometers south of their border, or is their goal to take over all the territory? And I realize they may not achieve their goal because of the Russians, Iranians, and Assad forces. Is their goal 70 kilometers, or is their goal something else?
So, Congressman, the real answer is I don't know, and I'm not sure any of us, I'm not sure anyone in the administration really knows. The Turks had talked about creating a 30-kilometer deep buffer zone and then sort of 300 miles across, which would have been both a security zone for the Turks as well as maybe an area in which to resettle some of the Arab refugees, Syrian Arab refugees that had been in Turkey. We've heard U.S. officials say, as I'm sure all of you have, that the Turks have gone farther than they anticipated, and by the Turks, I assume they really mean these kind of proxy forces that you were asking about, Congressman. So I assume they'll be guided both by whatever military objectives they have, as well as by this now move by the regime, plus Iranian plus Russian forces, in a sense to interpose themselves between the Turks and the areas further south. So there'll be maybe a little bit of a competition as well between the Turks and the regime forces.
Over the last year or two, when the Kurdish forces in Syria had control of territory, to what extent was that territory used as an identifiable source of terrorist action inside Turkey?
We asked that question to multiple different briefers, both in the U.S. government and when we traveled throughout the region. And while it is clear to us that there are ideological affiliations between the PKK and the YPG, and our report calls for specific actions for the YPG to differentiate itself from the PKK, we did not find examples where U.S. provided arms to the YPG in Syria made itself across the border into Turkey.
I'll just add, Congressman, though, that you'll find plenty of examples, especially from earlier parts of the war, of support for ISIS and so forth coming the other direction across the border, which is, again, one thing that we have not been able to successfully address with the Turks.
So the Turks did a terrible job of preventing ISIS from going into Syria, and the Syrian Kurds have done an excellent job of making sure that malevolent actors do not go from the territory they controlled up into Turkey, and yet Turkey begins this terrible conflict. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. I thank the witnesses and all members for being here today. Thank you both for your testimony. Thank you for your very thoughtful leadership of this important Syria study group, and thanks for the report that you've produced. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you. We ask them to please submit those within the next 5 days, and we ask that you respond in writing. I just want to thank you again for over the past 9 years. We've had many, many hearings on Syria, both here and in the full committee. We sit here at this moment with Assad having slaughtered over 600,000 people and almost 6 million refugees and 6 million people displaced inside the country, and the world's largest state sponsor of terror stronger now there than before. The country most dedicated to sowing discord and fighting democratic norms, stronger there than they were before. And what you've offered us here, I think, is a really important and useful tool for discussion. And I urge my colleagues all to take this seriously and to read it, and that it informs the work that we do going forward. Sincere thanks again for being here. And with that, we're adjourned.